my roots. And as I got older and became more and more passionate about movies, I also became more and more eager to see movies. And I used to see movies from other places around the world. And in New York, it was fantastic, particularly in the 50s. You got to see films from France and Sweden, Italy, former Soviet Union, Japan. And then one night, on a Sunday night, on Channel 9 in New York, they showed Pate Panchali with commercials, dubbed in English. But, and I'm telling you now, the thing about it is that, you know, I come from a family, Sicilian Americans, and my mother and father worked in the garment district. They were not educated. There were no books in the house. So there was no way for me to really be introduced to Indian culture in 1957 or 58, except through visual means. And this was the first film that I saw of Rai. And prior to that, I was aware of the Jean Renoir film, The River, that I believe he worked on, which is a very, very beautiful film, 1950. But when I saw Pate Panchali, it was something, despite the commercials, despite the poor print and the dubbed English, something entirely new and completely unexpected. Here was a place and people of which, where I was, given at the time and place, at the age of 15 or so, I had no previous understanding, no image to work from, no image at all. And yet I was moved by them and really moved by them and their way of life. I mean, all great film directors sort of interpret the world visually. They interpret the world around them. And before they can share that with their audience, they have to make it their own visually. And whenever we say a film offers a window on a world, and by world I mean something as big as a whole nation or something as small as a little apartment that you may have grown up in, maybe the filmmaker grew up in, it means that the filmmaker's been able to filter that world through their own artistry. And that's what the window is. It's artistry, individual artistry. And Satyajit Rai was one of the cinema's greatest artists. And for most of us who love film, he gave us our first glimpse of life in India and of Bengali history and culture in particular. And he gave us that glimpse through the lens of his poetic vision. The word poetic is used to describe filmmakers very often, but in Rai's case, it's especially meaningful. I just think of some of the pictures I saw in the late 50s, early 60s, Devi, Charyalata, and forgive my pronunciations. The Music Room, one of my favorites. The Opus trilogy, Mahanagar, Big City that is, and The Middleman, Two Daughters, and it goes on and on, name just a few. All these have moments where the distinction between poetry and cinema, just dissolves. His films opened my mind and inspired me, and I know they did the same for a lot of other filmmakers around the world, people like Kurosawa and Jean Renoir, of course, and I mentioned the extraordinary film The River, shot in Technicolor in 1950 in India. In my own case, his influence was incalculable. When I started trying to interpret the world around me, because of Pate Panchali and the village, you see, in a way, down on the Lower East Side, we were in a little Sicilian American village that was very different. We even looked at Eisenhower as the president. We wondered, he's representing us. I don't understand. Very different from Italian Americans. I was very young, and I didn't understand. How come we lived in that 3-4 block area. And I always said this when I went to New York University, finally, in the West Side, in Manhattan. I never really went to the West Side before. I just walked to school that day to enroll. I just walked straight down Houston Street, about 6 blocks. I was on the West Side the first time. But so in a way, I knew I was American, but I did have a very strong identity of coming from a kind of village in a way. And so I really looked to him as an example when I tried to create the view of my own world around me on film. His pictures today are exciting, and especially when you see them in good prints, they're as exciting, as revelatory and moving today as when we first encountered them. If anything, I must say, if you look at them again, over 20 years, they've gotten better, increased in greatness. Why? Which is why, really, it's so great to have the entire retrospective of all his films here in Washington. It's so important to have them preserved and intact for future generations. I have a blessed little child now, and I can't wait to show her some of these films and she can understand some of it as she gets older. She's 2 years old now. But about 7 years ago, we were able to see new prints of many of Rai's films presented in this country by Ishmael Merchant and James Ivory. But you know, there are many more, and they all need work, and they really need a lot of care. A lot of care. And one of these films you're about to see, The Chess Players. A little about the chess players. I mean, very few directors have been brave enough to even attempt to show history in the making. History in the making. Visconti did with The Leopard, Renoir, La Marseillaise, and Rossellini did with his war trilogy, Open City and Paisa, and Germany Year Zero. But there's also Satyajit and The Chess Players. Chess Players deals with a moment of incredible change, tumultuous change in Indian history, and it's told from a pretty sadly ironic and at times comical point of view that's kind of a hallmark of Ray's work. I mean, in a way, when I was watching it again, I looked at it again last week, and it's a beautiful print. The pastels, by the way, are amazing, the colors. But when I'm looking at this picture, I realize this is the way it must really feel to live through a moment of historic change. You know, it feels distant and tragic at the same time. And with that, I hope you enjoy The Chess Players tonight, and thank you for having me here. Good night.